Fiancée attacked the maid with a hockey stick. Then the billionaire walked in. And the toddler whispered 3 words she never wanted him to hear. She raised the hockey stick over her head. And for 1 second, everyone in that kitchen forgot how to breathe. The maid didn't scream. She didn't run. She just wrapped her arms around the little girl standing behind her and turned her own back to take the hit. Nobody in that house knew what was about to happen next. Not the fiancé holding the stick, not the staff frozen in the doorway, and especially not the billionaire who was about to walk through that front door 30 seconds too late. Or maybe just in time. Hey friends, welcome back. If you're new here, this is the place for real, raw, true-to-life stories about family, love, and the moments that change everything. Before we dive in, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your flag in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. This one right here. It's going to break your heart a little before it puts it back together. Let's get into it. Daniel Cole never planned on becoming the kind of man people whispered about at charity galas. 10 years ago he was just an engineer with a garage full of extension cords and an idea he couldn't stop thinking about. Now, at 40 years old, his name sat on the side of 3 office towers in Atlanta. His software ran quietly behind half the hospitals in the southeast, and his house, a sprawling stone estate just outside Buckhead, with its own pond and a driveway longer than most people's street, had been featured in a magazine he'd never actually read. None of that ever felt as real to him as the sound of the kitchen at 7 in the morning. That sound belonged to Michelle Turner. Michelle had been the head of household staff at the Cole estate for 5 years. She was 43 with steady hands, a laugh that came rarely but meant something when it did, and a way of moving through a room like she'd already thought 3 steps ahead of whatever was about to go wrong in it. She'd started as a part-time housekeeper back when Daniel was still eating cereal standing up at the counter because he hadn't bought a kitchen table yet. Somewhere along the way, she'd become the person who actually ran the house, while Daniel ran everything else. She never asked for more than what the job called for. She showed up early, left late, and kept her own life folded up small and private, tucked into the little guest cottage behind the main house where she lived with her daughter, Grace Turner was 4 years old, with 2 puffy pigtails her mother braided every morning before the sun came all the way up, and a habit of narrating everything she saw like a tiny news anchor. The bird is on the fence. The bird is walking. The bird is gone now. She was shy around strangers and lit up like a firework around the people she trusted. Daniel was one of those people, though even he couldn't quite explain why a 4-year-old's opinion of him mattered as much as it did. Michelle kept Grace close. Close enough that the household staff joked gently that the little girl had 2 full-time jobs, being 4 years old and shadowing her mother's every step. What nobody joked about, because nobody knew to, was the quiet, careful way Michelle steered Grace away from certain rooms when Vanessa was in the house. Vanessa Hart was 30 years old, beautiful in the effortless, photographed way that made people assume she'd never had a hard day in her life. She'd met Daniel 18 months ago at a fundraiser, and within a year he'd put a ring on her finger that cost more than most people's houses. Vanessa came from money herself, old Hart family money, the kind that came with country club memberships and a father who sat on boards. She was smart, sharp-tongued when she wanted to be, and she had a way of walking into a room like she already owned the furniture in it. She also had a way of looking at Michelle that made the temperature drop. It wasn't anything anyone could point to directly. Vanessa was never cruel in front of Daniel. She complimented Michelle's work at dinner parties, said things like, "I don't know what we'd do without her," in a voice as smooth as glass. But when Daniel wasn't in the room, something else came out. Clipped tone. Too long stare. Once she'd asked Michelle apropos of nothing, how long she planned on keeping the kid underfoot around here. Michelle had answered with a polite smile and gone back to folding towels. She'd learned a long time ago that some fights weren't worth having with your mouth. Some fights you just survived quietly until they passed. The wedding was 3 months away. Invitations had gone out. A tent the size of a small stadium was being built on the east lawn. Vanessa had thrown herself into the planning with the kind of intensity usually reserved for hostile takeovers, color-coding binders and firing 2 florists in a single week. Daniel, for his part, mostly nodded along and signed whatever was put in front of him, distracted by a company acquisition that was eating every hour of his day. He didn't notice at first the way Vanessa's shoulders tightened whenever Grace came skipping through the foyer. He didn't notice the way Vanessa started asking more and more often why the housekeeper's daughter needed to be on the property at all. Surely there was daycare, surely there was somewhere else she could be. He didn't notice because he had no reason yet to be looking. What Daniel did notice in small, unexplainable flashes was a strange tenderness in himself whenever Grace ran up to show him a rock she'd found, or a drawing of a house with too many windows. It embarrassed him a little. How much he looked forward to those 30 seconds between meetings. He told himself it was because he liked kids. He told himself a lot of things that spring. One Tuesday evening, Daniel came home late from the office to find Michelle sitting at the kitchen table long after her shift should have ended, a small shoebox open in front of her, an old photograph in her hand. She startled when he walked in, slid the box closed too quickly, and stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "Sorry, Mr. Cole. I was just finishing up." He waved her back down. "You don't have to call me that. And you don't have to jump like I caught you doing something." She managed a small laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Old habits." He glanced at the shoebox but didn't ask. It wasn't his business, he told himself. Everybody was allowed a box of things they didn't explain. What he didn't know, what nobody in that gleaming stone house knew yet, was that the photograph in Michelle's hand was 7 years old. It showed a younger Daniel before the money, before the towers with his name on them, standing outside a small apartment complex with his arm around a woman who was laughing at something just out of frame. Michelle put the box away in the bottom drawer of her dresser that night, under a stack of Grace's baby blankets, the same place it had lived, untouched and unexplained, for 4 years. She told herself, the way she told herself most nights, that some things were better left folded up small, that the life she'd built for her daughter, steady, safe, quiet, was worth more than any truth she could unpack. She didn't know yet how close that truth was to finding its own way out. What do you think that old photograph means? Let us know in the comments below. 3 weeks later, the house started to feel like a held breath. Vanessa had found something. She wouldn't have called it snooping. In her mind, she was simply organizing the guest cottage closets, Michelle's private space, technically part of the estate, technically hers to inspect if she wanted. Or so she told herself as she pulled a shoebox down from a high shelf while Michelle was out running an errand and Grace was napping in the next room. Inside, a photograph of Daniel, younger, unguarded, laughing. A folded letter with no envelope. And a hospital bracelet, pale pink, the kind they put on newborns, with a date on it that made Vanessa's stomach drop before her mind had even caught up to why. She didn't read the letter all the way through. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough headlines about billionaires and secret children to fill in the rest herself, and her imagination did what imaginations do when they're already primed for the worst. It ran, and it ran fast, and it didn't stop to check its facts along the way. She put everything back exactly where she'd found it. And then she didn't say a word to anyone. That was the part that made it dangerous. Vanessa didn't confront. She calculated. Over the following days, she started watching Michelle the way a person watches a fire they suspect is still smoldering under the floorboards. She watched how Daniel's face changed, just slightly softer, when Grace was in the room. She watched how careful Michelle was to keep Grace out of formal events, out of photographs, out of anywhere Vanessa might be standing. Before, Vanessa had read that carefulness as simple professionalism. Now she read it as guilt. She started picking fights about nothing. She told the wedding planner Grace's laughter carried too far from the guest cottage, and could they build a sound barrier? She accidentally left cutting comments in front of the caterers, wondering aloud if the household needed quite so much staff living on site. Michelle absorbed each one without comment, the way she always had, though her exhaustion was starting to show in the small hours she was sleeping. Daniel, meanwhile, was drowning in his own storm. The acquisition he'd been chasing for 8 months finally closed, and it should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like standing at the top of a mountain and realizing the view didn't fix anything underneath his ribs. He came home later. He drank one more glass of wine than he used to. He caught himself staring out at the guest cottage lights some nights, unsure what exactly he was looking for. One evening, he found Grace sitting alone on the back porch steps, knees pulled up, watching lightning bugs blink on and off over the lawn. "Hey, kiddo. Where's your mom?" Putting away the towels. Grace didn't look at him, fully absorbed in her lightning bugs. "Do you think they talk to each other?" "The bugs." Daniel sat down on the step next to her, closer than he probably should have, though it never occurred to him to think of it that way. "I think they probably do. In bug language." Grace nodded seriously, like this confirmed something important. Then, out of nowhere, the way 4-year-olds say things that land like small earthquakes. "My mom has a picture of you in her drawer. From before." Daniel went still. "Before what bug?" Grace shrugged, already losing interest, eyes back on the fireflies. "Before me." He sat there a long moment after she said it, the kind of moment where a person can feel something shifting under them without yet understanding what. He told himself it was nothing. Kids said strange, disconnected things all the time. He told himself that until Michelle came out onto the porch, saw the two of them sitting together, and went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the evening chill. "Grace, baby, time for bed," she said, her voice a half step too fast, too bright. She scooped Grace up before Daniel could ask anything else, and disappeared back toward the cottage without quite meeting his eyes. Daniel sat alone on the steps a long time after that, the fireflies blinking their strange bug language into the dark, something uneasy settling into his chest that he couldn't yet name. Vanessa found him there an hour later, still sitting, still quiet. "You've been out here a while," she said, in a tone that tried to sound casual and mostly failed. "Just thinking. About the housekeeper's kid." Daniel looked up at her, something in her voice catching his attention for the first time in weeks. "What is that supposed to mean?" Vanessa's jaw tightened. For a second, it looked like she might say everything. The shoebox, the bracelet, the letter, the math she'd already done in her head a dozen times. Instead, she swallowed it down, the way she'd learned to swallow things down her whole life, and forced a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Nothing. Forget it. I'm going to bed." She walked back into the house, and Daniel sat alone under a sky full of stars he was too distracted to look at, a small, cold seed of unease taking root in him that he wouldn't understand until it was almost too late to matter. 2 rooms away, Michelle sat on the edge of Grace's bed long after her daughter had fallen asleep, running a hand gently over her hair, whispering the same thing she'd whispered to her for 4 years. "I've got you, baby. No matter what. I've always got you." She didn't know yet that the ground under both of them was about to give way. Have you ever kept a secret to protect someone you love, even when it cost you? Tell us your story in the comments. And then, everything changed in a single moment. It started on an ordinary Thursday. Daniel had flown to New York for a board meeting and wasn't due back until evening. The house was quieter than usual. Quiet in that particular way big houses get, where every sound seems to travel farther than it should. Vanessa had spent the morning alone with her thoughts, and her thoughts had finally worn a hole clean through her. She'd gone back to the shoebox one more time. This time she read the whole letter. It was from a doctor's office, 7 years old, addressed to Michelle. Confirmed a pregnancy. It didn't name a father, the letter never did, letters like that never do. But paired with the photograph of Daniel, laughing, arm around a woman who Vanessa now understood with sick clarity, had been Michelle herself, 7 years younger and unguarded. It didn't need to. She did the math on Grace's age. 4 years old. The dates lined up close enough that Vanessa's mind slammed the door shut on any other possibility. She marched down to the guest cottage with her hands shaking, and found Michelle in the small kitchen there, folding laundry, Grace playing with blocks on the floor nearby. Is she his? Michelle turned, confusion flickering across her face before understanding landed like a stone in her stomach. Vanessa, I don't know what you don't. Vanessa's voice cracked down the middle, somewhere between fury and something rawer underneath it. Don't you dare stand there and lie to my face. His. You need to leave, Michelle said quietly, stepping instinctively between Vanessa and Grace, whose blocks had gone still, whose wide eyes were now fixed on the two women. This isn't the place, and it isn't the time, and it isn't. I have given up everything for this wedding. Vanessa's voice rose, cracking apart at the edges. My name, my family's business, 3 years of my life waiting for a ring. And you've been sitting out here this whole time with his child, letting me plan a wedding like some kind of joke. Vanessa, please lower your voice, she's scared. Something in Michelle's calm, the same calm that had absorbed every cutting word for months, seemed to enrage Vanessa further, like it was proof of guilt rather than restraint. Her eyes landed on the hockey stick propped against the wall by the door, left there weeks ago after a game of yard hockey Daniel had played with the groundskeeper's son. She grabbed it before she'd even fully decided to. Vanessa, don't. The first swing missed, wild and off balance, more warning than weapon. Michelle grabbed Grace and turned her own back, curling around her daughter, and the second swing landed across her shoulders with a sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the small kitchen. Grace screamed. That scream was the sound that reached Daniel first. Not the words, not the accusation, just the raw, high sound of a frightened child, as he came through the front door of the main house 3 hours earlier than planned. His board meeting cut short. His flight moved up on instinct he couldn't have explained even to himself. He ran. By the time he reached the cottage doorway, Vanessa had the stick raised for a third swing, Michelle's arms still locked around Grace, her back already darkening with the shape of the first hit. Vanessa. Stop. The stick froze midair. Vanessa turned, chest heaving, and for a moment nobody in that small kitchen moved at all. Daniel. Vanessa started, already reorganizing the story in her head, already reaching for the version where she was the wronged one. Daniel, you don't understand, she's been lying to you for years, that little girl is. Put it down. Something in his voice, flat, cold, final, made her arm drop on its own. Daniel crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and knelt in front of Michelle, who was still curled protectively around her daughter, her whole body shaking. Michelle. Michelle, look at me. Are you hurt? Is Grace? Grace pulled free of her mother's arms before Michelle could answer, tears streaking her small face, and ran the 3 steps into Daniel's chest, burying her face against his shirt the way she'd never had the courage to do before, arms locked around his neck like he was the only solid thing left standing in the room. And then, muffled against his collar, shaking, she whispered the 3 words that would end the wedding before it started. You're my daddy. The kitchen went utterly silent. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed with nothing coming out. Michelle's hand flew to her own mouth, 4 years of careful, guarded silence collapsing in half a second. Her eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with the pain in her shoulders. Daniel didn't move. Didn't breathe for a second that felt like it stretched into an hour. He looked down at the small girl locked around his neck, at her wet, wide eyes, at the shape of his own jaw he suddenly, impossibly, recognized in her face. What did you say, Bug? Grace pulled back just enough to look at him, hiccuping through her tears, too young to understand the size of what she'd just said, only understanding that it was true, and that it needed saying. My daddy, Mummy said. She said don't tell. But you're my daddy. Daniel turned slowly to look at Michelle, who was still on the floor, one hand braced against the cabinet, her whole body trembling. From the blow, from the secret finally breaking open, from 4 years of carrying something alone that had just been said out loud by a 4-year-old who didn't know any better than to tell the truth. Michelle. His voice barely made it out. Is it true? Michelle closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there were no more places left to hide. Yes, she whispered. She's yours, Daniel. She's always been yours. What would you do if you were in Daniel's place? Tell us honestly in the comments. For 3 full days, Daniel Cole didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. The house that had felt like a fortress now felt like a stage set, every hallway holding a version of the last 4 years he'd never gotten to see. He kept replaying small moments. Grace's laugh, the shape of her eyebrows when she concentrated, the shoebox Michelle had slid closed too quickly weeks ago, and watching them rearrange themselves into a picture he should have recognized long before a 4-year-old had to say it out loud for him. He'd called an ambulance for Michelle that first night, over her protests. 2 hairline fractures in her shoulder blade, the doctor said. Deep bruising along her back. She'd taken the blow across her own body rather than let it land anywhere near Grace, and something about that fact sat in Daniel's chest like a stone he couldn't put down. Vanessa was gone from the house within the hour. Not by choice. Daniel had called security himself, standing in the doorway of the cottage with Grace still gripping his hand, and told 2 of his own staff to escort her out and to make sure she didn't come back onto the property. He'd called the police the next morning, not out of anger alone but because some part of him understood, clearly and coldly, that a woman capable of that kind of violence in a moment of jealousy was not someone he could simply uninvite from a wedding. Assault charges were filed. Whatever happened with them legally would happen. That part, at least, felt simple compared to everything else. The wedding, of course, was over. Nobody had to say it out loud. The tent still being built on the east lawn was quietly dismantled 2 days later, the crew instructed to take it down without explanation, though half of them had already heard some version of what happened from the household staff, who had, in turn, heard it from each other in the particular hushed, fast way that news moves through a house full of people who all live and work under the same roof. What Daniel hadn't expected was how complicated his feelings toward Michelle would turn out to be, tangled up with the tenderness he already felt for Grace. He sat with her in the cottage kitchen on the second evening, Grace finally asleep in the next room, and asked the question that had been circling him for 2 days straight. Why didn't you tell me? Michelle didn't look away, though it clearly cost her something not to. Because you just started this company that was going to change your whole life. Because I didn't want you marrying me out of obligation, or feeling trapped, or resenting a daughter you never chose to have. Because I've watched enough men in this world do the right thing out of guilt instead of love, and I didn't want that for her. I wanted her to have a father who chose her, all the way if that ever happened, not one who got backed into it. You could have let me choose 4 years ago. You were 29 and just starting out, still eating cereal standing up at your kitchen counter, Michelle said, and something almost like a smile flickered and died on her face. I didn't think you were choosing anything back then except the next round of funding. Stung mostly because it wasn't wrong. And instead you just worked here. For years. Raised her 20 feet from my back door and never said a word. I needed a job. You needed a housekeeper. It let me keep her close to. Michelle stopped, swallowed. Close to whatever piece of you she was going to grow up wanting to know about eventually. I told myself I'd tell you when the time was right. Kept telling myself that. Time was never right. And then it wasn't my choice to make anymore. Daniel sat with that a long moment, the kitchen clock ticking loud in the quiet. There was a second complication neither of them had fully reckoned with yet, and it came from Vanessa herself 3 days later, in a phone call Daniel almost didn't answer. You want to know why I really said yes to you? Vanessa's voice was different now. Brittle, stripped of its usual polish. My father's company was 6 months from bankruptcy when we met. The merger talks with your firm saved us. I was supposed to save my family by marrying well. That's all this ever was for either of us if we're being honest. You needed a fiancé who photographed well for the investors, and I needed your name on our paperwork. I just didn't expect to actually. She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, and hung up before he could ask her to. It didn't excuse what she'd done. Nothing could excuse raising a hockey stick against a woman protecting her child. But it left Daniel with an uncomfortable clarity about what his engagement had actually been built on, underneath all the seating charts and calligraphy, and how far that was from anything real. That night, he stood outside the cottage a long time before knocking, watching the small light in Grace's window, turning over the shape of the last 4 years, and the shape of whatever came next. When Michelle opened the door, he didn't come in right away. "I'm not asking you to explain anything else tonight," he said. I want to know her. However that looks. Whatever you need it to look like. I want to know my daughter." Michelle's eyes filled, and this time she let them. "She's wanted that for a long time," she said. "Longer than either of us probably realized. Have you ever had to make a choice this hard? Share your story below." 6 months later, the East Lawn had a different kind of tent on it. Not a wedding tent, a smaller one striped blue and white, set up for Grace's 5th birthday party, with a bounce house Daniel had researched far too extensively for a man who ran 3 companies, and a cake Michelle had insisted on making herself, despite Daniel's staff offering more than once to bring in someone professional. "I am professional," Michelle had said, arms crossed, and that had been the end of that conversation. The assault case against Vanessa had been resolved quietly months earlier. A plea deal, probation, a restraining order that kept her a comfortable distance from the estate. Daniel didn't think about her often anymore, though every so often, usually late at night. He found himself grateful in a strange, backward way. If Vanessa hadn't gone looking for a secret that wasn't hers to find, if her jealousy hadn't boiled over into that kitchen on that particular Thursday, he might have gone another year, 2 years, 5 years, without ever hearing 3 words whispered against his collar that changed the shape of his whole life. He didn't marry Michelle. Not right away. Not for the reasons anyone watching from the outside might expect. What grew between them instead was slower and steadier than that. Something built out of 5 years of quiet trust that had been there long before either of them had words for it, and 6 new months of Daniel showing up, consistently, without being asked twice. He learned how Grace liked her eggs. He learned the exact bedtime routine, the 3 stuffed animals that had to be arranged in a specific order, the song that had to be hummed, never sung with actual words, or she wouldn't settle. He learned slowly how to be a father instead of just a man who was told he was one. Michelle, for her part, learned how to stop preemptively bracing for things to fall apart. It was a harder habit to break than either of them expected. Old fears don't leave just because the danger that created them is gone. But there were nights she caught herself laughing at something Daniel said, easy and unguarded, and realized she hadn't planned the laugh, hadn't measured it first to make sure it was safe. That, more than anything, felt like healing. The final, unexpected beat came on the morning of Grace's birthday party itself. Small and easy to miss if you weren't watching closely. Grace, mid-conversation with a group of other 4- and 5-year-olds from her new preschool, pointed across the lawn at Daniel, who was wrestling with a stubborn helium tank, and announced, with a total unbothered confidence only a 5-year-old can manage, "That's my dad. He builds computers. And he's really bad at balloons." No qualifiers. No hesitation. No 4 years of careful silence behind the words this time. Just a fact stated plainly, the way facts are supposed to be stated when they've finally been allowed to be true out loud. Michelle, watching from the porch with a slice of cake in each hand, felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for half a decade finally fully let go. If there was a lesson underneath all of it, and there was, though nobody said it in so many words that day, it was this: the truth doesn't wait for a convenient time to arrive. It comes when it comes, sometimes through a locked shoebox, sometimes through a jealous swing of a hockey stick, sometimes through the unguarded mouth of a child who doesn't yet know how to keep a secret and, in the end, was never supposed to have to. And love that's built on honesty, even honesty that arrives late and loud and a little bit broken, tends to hold up a lot better than love that's built on the version of things that's easiest to say. Daniel finally got the balloon tied, handed it to Grace, and got tackled by 6 5-year-olds who wanted balloons of their own. Michelle stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the man who was once just her employer, and was now something she didn't fully have a clean word for yet. But didn't need one, not really, not anymore. Chase a gaggle of shrieking children across a lawn that used to be measured for wedding tents. And if you've made it this far with us, thank you. Truly. Stories like this one remind us that the families we build aren't always the ones we planned for. Sometimes they're the ones that find us anyway, whispered into being 3 words at a time. If this story moved you even a little, hit that like button. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this every single week. And if you want more real, emotional stories about family secrets and the moments that change everything, go ahead and subscribe because we've got a lot more where this came from. Tell us in the comments. What part of this story hit you the hardest? We read every single one and we love hearing from you. If you know someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way home, send this video their way today. Thanks for watching, friends. We'll see you in the next one.